So today we're going to be building something like this. This is a form in Blazor. This form has validation going off because I'm purposely trying to submit it without data. And this is what will happen. So you will learn exactly how to build something like this today, along with validation in order to make sure that you have the data that you expect to come back in. So stay tuned. Welcome everybody to another episode of Blazor Basics. And this time we're going to be discussing how to create forms and how to validate them. Now, what is a form and what is validation? Well, if you ever put in data on a website, that is a form. And if you ever incorrectly put in that data and it yells at you, having little red text at the bottom saying you missed something, that is validation. And you always want this on your web applications or website, whatever. If you are gathering data from people, it is your first line of defense when you are trying to gather that data. So in this case, we're going to be learning how Blazor handles these forms. So Blazor handles forms by allowing you to use certain components that were built to create forms. Now, what is a component? A component is basically just an HTML element with some code behind it, but we're not going to get into that in this video. We're going to do that in another one coming up because I can go quite deep. However, in this one, you just have to know that Blazor has some pre-made components that allow you to use forms and handle all that validation and stuff in it. So you'll see this as we go into the project. Now, the most common type of component that we're going to be using is called the edit form. Now, this particular component is special. It can actually handle, forms and a bunch of components that work with the forms. And this is probably going to be the most common type of component you're going to be using when using forms. And along with this component, there are going to be subcomponents within it that handles the actual input, like your text inputs, your number inputs, if you have a list, a select input, all these things. And we're going to be tackling a few different types in this one form. So you have a basic idea of how to build one that is, that has all the different kinds of things you might expect in a form. So obviously this is a basic tutorial, so it's not going to be that complicated, but you will be exposed to a couple of new components out there that exist just for this. So we're going to be going to the project right now. Hey everybody, so I hope you open up your Blazor projects and don't worry about all this. This is just one of the other tutorials that I have in my list. So this was the route tutorial, which you could watch up here. And now we're going to get started on this one. You do not need to do any of the other tutorials prior, only if you need a refresher. Once again, these are all modular courses. You may do them without doing the other ones. Let's continue. So this is just the old stuff that I have here. You don't need that. No test razor, no route razor, need none of this. But you will need this nav menu. Now, because we've learned already how to navigate and create pages, we're just going to be doing that for this one as well. So we will be creating its own tab in here, and we will have a page just for this tutorial. So just do what I do. We're just going to copy paste the last list element here, right on the bottom, and we're going to call this basic form. It's going to be a very easy peasy tutorial, but we will get into forms more or less, so you'll be able to make your own forms on an actual project somewhere. And we're just going to be called this basic form. So now that you have that, you have your tab ready to go. Next thing we're going to do is add that form page here. So we're just going to add that. Raise your component. These are all components, but don't worry too much about the nitty gritty of that. Just make sure you call it basic form. Capital B, please. And I just use camel notation. So up here, we will add this to be searchable by the page. Basic. So we're going to do a quick test to make sure that I didn't screw up. And I'll be skipping this. Beautiful. As you can see, we have the paging set up just fine. And now we have the page here. This is an empty page. We do not need this anymore. And what we will do is start with the namespace you need to import. So just follow what I'm doing. You're going to need this. Might be doing things out of order, but we need access to this data page here because in order to create a form, you need a model. Now, intro. And behind the scenes there. So intro project data, and in here we're going to be creating something called a model. The model is what your form is going to need in order for it to do its validation, in order for it to actually interpret the data that you expect it to have. So in this case, we're going to create a new item. It's going to be just a C# class, and we're just going to call it basic form model. Now, I know you might be tempted to call this just basic form, but do not do that. The reason why is because you might confuse this, because the actual name of what we call this component is basic form as well. So as a rule of thumb, whenever you're creating a model for anything, not just this, always have this a model name attached to the end of it all. So because I want to demonstrate a few different types of the components needed to filter certain data, what I'm going to do is have a few different types of that data here. In other words, I'm going to have 6 different properties to demonstrate the form. But wait, let's not get started with that just yet. So we will have a string, and we will have this form to be, I don't know, like you're trying to put a job posting, yeah. So we'll have a public job title, public job description, and if you don't know why it's doing that, it's because I've done this already before, so it remembers the properties I've been using. So don't worry, I'm not gonna go too fast for you. I'll just go slow. So the next one is gonna be a date time component, and we're gonna call it, must be missing a package, just go grab that. If you are missing a package, just click that little red button and you'll be fine. Date of posting. Get. So yeah. So the way that Blazor handles its forms is that each one has a component that's related to the type of property you're using. So that's why I have strings and I have datetime. And the next one's going to be a Boolean, which I will call currently employed. So this is basically just your HR app. And then the next one's going to be a decimal. Doesn't matter really what the number is, I believe. I think that you have to use the same component for all of them. But could be wrong, but that's okay. And Microsoft has a list of these components on its website, which I have in the description below in case you want to look at it, if I haven't already shown it earlier on in this video. Get tired of writing gets it all the time, just copy paste. So right now we have 3 strings, a decimal, a bool, and a date time object. Now there's a reason why I have so many strings, because I want to demonstrate different things here. Now in order for you to do validation, because we're going to do it all at the same time, you need something, you need one of these. Now this is called an attribute. In case specifically, we're going to add a required attribute. So what you do with this, first you have to import the package, and now we could add data annotations to each and every one of these properties. So when we go and create the form and it refers off this model, it will know that we require the user to submit data for these properties that we have the required attribute for. So every job needs a title, every job has a description, and I'm just going to add them for all of them. I'm going to format it in a way that I don't want to format it, but that's fine. So we'll just leave it like that, I guess. And not only that, but your validation can also be a lot more specific. So we could actually add something else down here and add a requirement. So when you're working with different properties, they have different ways of doing this. In this case, in order to add a requirement for the string, this case, we want to work with the string length. You have to write this underneath the data attribute. Just write what I'm writing now, and I'll explain it as we go along. So all I'm doing is making sure that my job title has a limit of 15 characters. And if we ever reach past the limit, we're going to send a message called shorten this. So I'm going to leave these alone and add only to this decimal here. A way of this is how you would do numbers basically. So you would instead use a range instead of a string length up there, and you can you need to get the type that you're using. So in this case, we are using the decimal type of decimal, and this is basically a function. So you have to fill this in with your range. So your range has to be in string quotations. But that's basically, we're just saying here that for this decimal property of years of experience is 1 to 200, the number that we're willing to accept. And if it doesn't do that, it will send an error message basically. And this right here, this string is going to be used in a list. And I want to show you how to create the select list, which is the drop-down list, and use this in order for you to have it on the form and to validate it correctly off of the options in the list. But that will come now. So now that we have this model ready to go, we can finally use it in our form. Now we have to just build out the form. So now we can actually begin working on the form on the HTML. So there's going to be a combination of code and HTML here, and there might be a bit of stuff that we're going to go back and forth on, but that's only to explain this a lot better. So the very first thing is underneath here, I want to write the actual form component that we're going to use. This case is going to be called edit form, and this is a component that Blazor offers you in order for you to create a form with the with its components. So there's more to this that we're going to add, but we're just going to add the skeleton here, and then we'll go back to it later. So within this edit form class, we're going to be adding all the input types so that it works with this form. But before we do that, we have to make sure that the form has a model associated with it, aka what we did here, in order for it to be able to interpret the data we want to put in and to validate it. So how do we do that? Well, we did half the work already by having this data, access to this data folder that has our basic form model. All we have to do is initialize it within the code piece. So write basic form model, and if you don't see this, that means you have something wrong with the input. So it should be right away showing up. Call it test model equal to new basic form model. Oops. And now we have the model to work with. And we could start adding to the form by first adding the model to it. And the way you do that, all forms need a model. So you need to add this, the model here, and at test model. So now this form will be able to interpret the properties of test model and apply it to whatever's inside of here. Now, how do we apply it? Well, before we get into applying the actual individual inputs, I'm going to get a new battery. So right now, the most important bit of creating this form is here, which is the actual test model. Now we need to start adding stuff into this form in order for you to actually see, to actually start inputting stuff into it. So we would do that is by putting in input components. So I'll show you how to do that now. So we're going to make this look nicer by having a div first. And then we're going to have a class of form group in here. So this way everything lines up nicely in the form. And now we will call upon an input text. This will be something that one of our properties will be assigned to, specifically the string property. It could be either one because it works the same way. So how do you bind this property? Well, you have the test model here, and you have the properties here. So we know that we want the job title for the first one. You will bind it like we normally bind everything else, with the bind value equals to at test model dot job title. So you bound it here, and then we'll also add a class of form control as well. This is a HTML, this is a CSS thing, so just add it there. And then we're gonna need an ID down here. Now, I would normally have this looking a little better, but because, you know, screen is kind of tight, just move this out of the way. We're not gonna really need to go back and forth anymore, so I'm just gonna move that all the way so we can have it all. I'll just move back here. And this will be ID of this particular. ID is equal to job title. Now we need that ID because we're gonna add a label to it, which is gonna be the thing that you see that it's called. Not only that, but this is where I believe you'll also see the validation messages when we get to it. And you can call it whatever you want here. You don't have to call it job title, obviously. So in this case, you have a basic input text, which is just the string text that is referring off of this form here. And in order for you to make sure that your forms go through the submit process, you need a button, the submit button. So we're just gonna add that right now. Input type to submit. I'm gonna add a bootstrap class to it. Some color. Button primary. And value equal to. So now our form has a input button in there and it has an input text. So now let's run what we have here so far. So because you have this form testing for all the properties, nothing's gonna happen. And because we have no validation messages ready to go, you're not gonna say anything. In fact, to you, it's gonna look like nothing's happening. But there is actually something happening in the background. So in order to see what's going on in the background, you will need to add these two components here. One is called the DataAnnotationsValidator, and one is called the ValidationSummary. Now what this does is takes whatever messages you have here, and those are the messages that are gonna show up. And what this does is that it puts all the messages in a list wherever this component is on the form. So if it's over here, it's gonna be on the top of it. So regardless of where the messages are coming from, it'll have them all in a list. There's one more component that I'll get into later that allows you to have the messages in a line specific to wherever you want it on the form, but we don't need that right now. Now you're gonna see what's actually happening in the background. It's saying that all those required properties that we have there, we have the required data annotation on, that they have to be here. They're not being provided, which is true. We don't have them on the form yet. So even if I were to put a job title, it'll only check off one of the requirements, but the other ones will not be checked out. So that means that we have to add the rest of these inputs in there for the rest of the items. So how do we do that? We're just going to copy paste this a few times. And then here, this one's going to be job description. I'm going to be going a little quicker now. For job, I'm just calling it job DSC. The job title. Call the job. The next one out of here gonna be date of posting. So date of posting is a different type of variable. it's the date time type. So you have to actually change this to this specific input. So in this case, there's, as you can see, there's a number of inputs here. I don't know if you actually see this, but what we're looking for is the input date. So it's the job description, we're going to be looking for our date of posting. Job date. Call this job date. So as you guess, each one of these types exists for basically every one of the variables that exists, except the more complex ones that you can create later on. But that is something for another time, and that's not in the scope of what we're doing now. This one's going to be the Boolean. Call it current temp. And there's a Boolean one. But the Boolean one is checkbox and radio, but we want to use the checkbox for this one. Current void. I spelled it with one. The next one after this is decimal, I believe, which is the years of experience. So here we're going to call it years experience. Call this just XP. Call this X. And we're going to get the, well, you kind of get the point, right? Like, you know what I'm doing here. So we're just going to do each one of them. There's only one that's actually a bit special, but that we'll get to not right now. This can't be an input checkbox. This has to be an input number. And this last one is a string. So this last one, we're going to use it a bit differently. Just copy this as you would. This one is seniority level. So what we're saying is that, are you a mid-level? Are you a senior level? Are you an entry-level person in this case? So we're just going to put seniority for the label. Okay. Experience ability. But we're not going to use an input number. We're going to put an input select. I spelled it wrong, but that's fine. There it is. So in order to work with this specific one, we need to have a list inside of this input select component. So within this component, bear with me, we're just going to add for now this option. Call it selected value, but nothing for the value, and call it select. So what this is, it's going to add one option called select, but it won't have a value on it, which means that when you do select it and try to submit it, it's still not going to work. But we're going to get to how to make it work in a second. But now we're going to head into the actual code portion here. So we already have this basic form model in order for this form to know all the properties it needs. We have our validation here so that it would be triggered when it gets submitted, and you'll actually see it. But now we need to do something with this input select. So the way you do this is, because we're going to use a list of string here, in this case a list of string of like the three things I said, we'll have a list of string here. Call it experience list equal to list of. You're wondering why I make so many mistakes? Because this keyboard I'm using is not an English keyboard. So I'm still not, it still feels weird to me. Oh yeah, we're gonna add this, by the way. So in fact, let's add this piece now. We're gonna add it to the top piece. We're gonna use it for an example later, and I just don't want to forget it. So add it up here. Give it an H3 value. Call it form status, and then we're just going to insert it here. We're not going to use this just yet, but it will be there, up there for the moment. And we'll call it nothing. Now, normally I would explain this a little bit further into details, but since this isn't the right video for this, I will just tell you that when you work with a component like this, you need to work within its life cycle. So if you want to fill in data, you have to do something like this. Like data before the component gets rendered, you have to have something on the onInitialize. And in this case, we want to put data in this list. So in order to do that, you first have to just add whatever data here. So what do you do? What would you use this for is if you're getting data, let's say from the database, you would put that code here. In this case, I'm just doing it because this is the good practice way of doing it. You could just probably put it up here and it'll be fine. But this is just for later, and I'll get into this in a different video. So as I said, we're going to be adding 3 selections here, and they all have to be lists. I mean, they all have to be strings because it's a string list. Finally, and because of good practice, we'll be adding this here. So every time it gets initialized, this gets reset to nothing. So what do we expect with this? We should be able to get the list to be seen here, but we still haven't added that list into this InputSelect. There are a few different ways to do it. You could do it manually, and you could have an option for each one of these different types, but that isn't the good way of doing it. The good way of doing it is by having a for each loop run through the list and add them to the select list. So you do not have to add them manually, and you don't have to worry about if you ever change the data later on. And the way you do that is by doing this. For X reach. So here we is. So we're just going to loop through that list that we made down there. And for each one, copy this option here. Delete the selected. Put an at XP, and then since that will also be the name, I'm going to add it here. So what we're doing is that we're adding the value of that name to the option, and also having the name itself be what you see in the selected list. So when this renders, it will insert all this into this list here, and then once that happens, it will go through the list and add them as options to this InputSelect. Along with this, which is hard coded by us, but that's fine. This is you need one of these options to have this in order for it to be counted as selected. So this is the really easy way of doing it, by just adding something like that in there. But if you ever needed to, let's say you had a requirement that doesn't allow you to do that, you can add it in here instead. Let's say on an if statement, like if it's the last one on the list, add it there, or if it's the first one, add it there. So another thing you can do. And now we basically have our form put together. Let's run it. Big checkbox, but okay. You see how this looks like. Alrighty, I'm gonna move this a little here. All right, that's fine. So move it up. So let's try to just submit it as is and see what happens. Everything that has no value in it, will get, we'll tell you that you haven't done it correctly. This one is, not done correctly because the range we gave was 1 to 200. So once we change this to 1 to 200, it will work. And the select has no value associated with it. So this is counted as no value. So you are expecting a value, the form is, and it's telling you, no, you don't have it. So let's try this for tester. We test stuff. See, these are going away. So is this nice and dynamic. This is going to be false off the bat. And I want 201 years of experience. Oh, it doesn't let me. Wanted 200. Being a little ageist here, but here. That would just put 50 years experience, but this is modern day and you need experience, before you get the job. So you need 50 years of experience for an entry level job these days. It's just how it works. Now we could save. Now we don't know whether or not it went through. There's no data to back it up. We can't look at a database. So how do we know when we have submitted the form? There's one more thing you should know how these forms work, and actually it is how to do the on-submit, unvalidated, whatever. So there's our functions that are created for you that you can use in order to determine whether or not you submitted something so that you could add code to it later on, and we're going to do that now. So you just saw we tried to submit it, but we don't actually know whether or not that submission actually worked. But the edit form has 3 different functions that each will tell you whether or not it did work. And we're just going to go over the most common one here, which is called onSubmit. And we don't have a function ready to go yet, but we will call it form submitted and we'll build it now. Together. And down here, we're just going to build that very function. Protected override, protected void. Call it that. And we're just gonna do form status, which is the thing we had added a little bit earlier, and we'll just write submitted. So how this works is that regardless whether or not your form actually was successful in its submission, it will trigger the submitted whatever the submitted function is. However, there's a bit of peculiarity when you do it like this, and you're gonna see what I mean. So look at the form status. I try to save and it just says submitted. But notice that none of our error messages are coming out. And that is because we're missing something to do with this because we haven't actually validated it yet. What's happening is that the unsubmit is taking its place, the validation piece. But that's okay. We can still have an onSubmit function. It's just we need to change this and ensure that we validate it manually. In order to do that, I'm just going to copy paste this here. Need to write edit context. I'm going to call it edit context. And what this does is it allows us to not only read off the whether or not it's validated, but it also allows us to validate this form. It's going to be called edit context dot validate. And that is what we need in order to validate the form. Because if we don't do that, you're gonna that what just happened there keep happening. You won't be able to validate it yourself. And we want to know whether or not it's validated this time now that we have this information with us. So we're just gonna write a quick little basically if statement here. So this, now that we run this, it will tell us whether or not it's been validated, whether it's been success or fail, and actually, trigger the validation. So let's just do that. Boom, it's failed. So click everything here. It's success. Also, a quick side note, if you look at the job date here, this is set to like the first year of humanity. You could set that by default back in the model if you want, or in the uninitialized state, depending. So you might want to do it on initialize if you want to just get the date, or in the model. It doesn't really matter. But just as a little side note. But yeah, but now we have validation happening once again. So you see, and we also know whether or not the form status has been submitted and whether or not it's failed or not. So that is one way of doing that. And now there's another way of doing it. This one's a bit more specific. I would just probably use this, but what you could do is something like this. On InvalidSubmit is equal to at InvalidSubmit. So we're going to create this also, and on ValidSubmit equal to ValidSubmit. Gonna make it easy for us. Gonna copy that. Now this time you do not need to add any any parameters in there. And we're just gonna call form status to valid. So we change the name up a little bit. Next one's gonna be called just make sure that I wrote it correctly. Valid submit. It's supposed to be capital S. Fine, that's fine. And here, obviously gonna be called invalid. And a quick side note as well, you can't have all three of them at once. You have to choose either using the onSubmit or using these two. So I believe that this will validate it on its own, so you don't have to actually do the edit context thing. We'll find out now. Yeah, so right now it's invalid. I went through the OnInvalidSubmit, and it's valid now, so it changed it to valid. And I believe that is it for today. Yep, that is it. That's all forms. That is all you need to do to understand forms. Go back here real quick. The most important thing about the form is making sure that you have a model attached to it so that it could actually read the properties, and then having this validation summary and this data annotations validator. Oh, I did miss one thing though. This is the last validation component you can use. And in this case, we're using the other type of binding here for level of experience through the validation message. So what happens here is that you will get the message come out next to wherever you put this for whatever the error is. So I'm just gonna run it one more time, and you'll see that the message will pop out on top of it. So if you want to get those messages coming out right next to the actual boxes, that is how you do it. So as you can see here, here's the message. We still have the validation summary up here, so it's gonna keep showing up here. But if you want your messages to look like this, then you have to add that validation message thing right next to it. And now that's already it. So this is the basic overview of how forms work. There is always more to learn, and there are things that you have to keep in mind, especially with complex objects. It doesn't work too well with forms. You have to do extra steps. But for the most part, if you're making a simple form, it's actually pretty easy to do. And despite how long this tutorial might be, it's just to make sure that you have all the tools you need so that you can have, whatever kind of forms you want, and to make sure that when you do the submissions, you have your flexibility of whatever logic comes next. And that's it for this tutorial. So please like and subscribe if you want. Look at my other tutorials out there. Comment in the comment down there. The description has, I think, a link to Microsoft documents if you want to know more about this later on. And that's really it, guys. And yeah, most of you are men, so it doesn't matter. Anyways, I think I'm done for today. Thank you very much. Peace out.